There are plenty of places in Scripture that we can turn this morning or any time to be reminded of fathers and fatherhood. One of my favorites, one that continues to challenge me, we're going to look at this morning, and that's in, surprise, surprise, Luke's Gospel. Chapter 15 in particular, you know the story. Hopefully you know the story. Maybe the number rings a bell. It is often called the parable of the prodigal son. But in fact, that's probably not the best name for it. And I want to make that case to you this morning. Jesus was talking to a group that he loved dearly. He had been teaching in various venues, and in this particular one he had, once again, his friends. Those we know as the tax collectors and sinners, right? Those who were lined up with the government taking tolls. Those were people not considered favorable by the larger society around them. There were sinners, people that were outcast, people that were not welcomed in the community, people who were looked down upon and seen as less than. These were the people who came around, and they came around in this particular instance to once again listen to Jesus teach. It's fascinating to think who was listening to Jesus, because from very early in Luke's Gospel, Luke's been telling us that Jesus came to teach. He came to give the good news, right? He came to proclaim the kingdom of God coming. And he came to proclaim that. He came to give that good news to anybody who would listen. You would think God's people would have just been running to him to hear. Who of us today wouldn't love to have Jesus come back and begin to put in place the kingdom? Good grief, if you didn't want that before the last few months, man. Come on, Jesus. You know? But it wasn't so back then. The very people we would have expected to be listening were offended. They were turned off by him. And it tells us way back in Luke's Gospel, as early as chapter 5, when Jesus was calling Matthew, or some translations speak of him as Levi. When he called them, Levi was a representative of that group, and he had fellow tax collectors and other guests eating with him. And God's people, the leaders of God's people, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, complained bitterly, it says in chapter 5. Bitterly they complained. In particular, I'm in verse 30 and 31 of chapter 5. The Pharisees and the teachers of religious law complained bitterly to Jesus' disciples. Why do you eat and drink with such scum? Then later in chapter 7, Jesus has again been teaching, and there's yet another complaint. There's yet another complaint about who Jesus is drawing and why he is drawing these sinners, these tax collectors. It is really hard to imagine how Jesus must have felt. And so in chapter 15, we have him surrounded by these same friends, and these same religious leaders and Pharisees are complaining. Why are you associating with such sinful people? And then Jesus began to tell them stories. Parables, really, but stories. Stories in which he was trying to get them to know his Father. I don't know if, as a son, if any of you have ever tried to explain to someone who your dad is. Maybe when they didn't know your dad at all. And you were trying to find ways of describing to them, knowing that, in most cases, you don't have all day long. You've got to be kind of concise. You've got to figure out a way to try to capture the essence of who your dad is in a way that's engaging, in a way that they'll remember, in a way that really encompasses all of who your dad is, but doesn't take up all day long to tell them. That's a little bit about what Jesus is doing here as he tells these stories. He tells 3 different stories, and we may look at the first 2 in future sermons, but today we're going to look at the third of these stories, and as I said, it's typically referred to as the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the lost son. Let me read it to you. I'm in chapter 15, verse 11. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. In other words, these 3 stories, the story of the lost sheep, the story of the lost coin, then the story of the lost son, all were told for the same purpose. Jesus began, a man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. You can't imagine what an insult that was. In that day, a little different than ours, whatever a father owned, typically the land, maybe a farm, and the father had a responsibility to provide for his family. That was the culturally accepted norm. Everybody expected that of the father. And while the sons knew they would inherit, and there were laws to determine how that was to take place, for example, the oldest son was to gain 2/3, and in this case, the younger son would have gained 1/3. They weren't to gain that until after the father had died, because the father not only had the privilege of owning that, he had the responsibility of caring for his family. Now, there was a way for the father to distribute before death, but that didn't just come as a gift. They came with responsibility. You see, if the father was to divide up his property before he died, the sons that inherited it took over the responsibility for caring for the whole family until the father was gone. For a son to ask for the estate before you die, before the father dies, well, you would have been thinking one of 2 things. You're either willing to take on a pretty substantial responsibility now, or you are one audacious, arrogant, spiteful young man, spiteful son. What an awful insult. A few days later, so how would you expect the father to respond? In this story it says, so his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. He didn't take care of anybody. There was no fulfilling any kind of responsibility. In fact, he packed up so quickly and left, you get the idea that he had no intention from the beginning of taking care of anybody. He packed up everything he had and he moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his field to feed pigs. This would have been the lowest of low for a Jewish man. Pigs were unclean, and to spend any time near them, let alone feeding them, would have been the bottom of the bottom. But that's where he found himself, and he was so hungry that even the pods that he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. But no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have enough food to spare. And here I am dying of hunger. I'll go home to my father and I'll say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. Again, a little background may help you. There were different types of servants on a farm. You would have had the normal servants that would have been really accepted almost like family. That's not the servant he's talking about. He's talking about the hired servant, the day laborers, those who had no connection, no guarantee. In other words, they could have been dismissed without rhyme or reason at the drop of a hat. And he's saying, I'll take on even that role because I don't deserve anything better. So he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. You know what he said, right? Man, I can't wait till that sucker gets home. That sorry rascal embarrassed me to my other son, embarrassed me to the village and the community. Pay for it? Oh, you just wait. I'm not a dad, but I can imagine. Just give me 5 minutes with this turkey. It's not the way Jesus told the story. He said, even from a long way off, the father saw him. We were laughing with Jim outside before the service. Strange to see Jim without your glasses on. It's not strange to be able to see, though, is it? We have the ability to see incredibly today, much better than many of them saw back then. But for that father to see his son from a long way off, it tells us something. It wasn't just a glance. He was looking. Day after day after day, he was looking. Maybe today will be the day he comes home. And then he ran to him. Again, you'd have to know the background. You'd have to understand that it wasn't just a matter of being old. It wasn't just a matter of maybe not being in condition. It wasn't just a matter of, well, how far are you going to have to run? It was a matter of fact that you were undignified as a father if you ran. First of all, you wore a tunic. And to run, you had to pull the tunic up, right? You had to hike that thing way up your knees. You ever tried to run with a, ladies, help us out here. You ever tried to run with a, yeah, I'm getting some nods, you know, and you're really moving on, aren't you? So he's got to hike that thing way up, and now his legs are exposed. Rather embarrassing. The story doesn't say anything about embarrassment. It just simply says he ran. He hiked up that tunic and he took off at a full-pace run. And he kissed him. He hugged him and he kissed him. So the young man began with a confession he had probably rehearsed over and over and over. You ever been in trouble? You ever had to go to tell your parents what you've done? I mean bad trouble. Yeah, I'm Jay. I mean when you really messed up, you know? And you've gone over and over and over because you want to get it right, because you really need it to go well. And he says to his dad, Father, I've sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. It was the next part that was the critical part. He wasn't just coming to restore the relationship. He wasn't just coming back to say, hey, will you accept me again? He was hungry. He needed to eat. He needed to be taken care of. And he knew that despite the fact that he would be a hired, dismissible at any time servant, he knew that in his father's keep, he'd be well fed. So just as he gets ready to tell his dad that, just as he gets ready to say, would you take me on in that role? Because that's all I deserve. His dad doesn't even let him finish. He interrupts him. But his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. Kill the calf we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead. He was dead because the relationship was gone. He was dead because the most important thing to the Father was not what many of us today would consider. It wasn't the Son's obedience, though that was important. It wasn't all the money he had wasted, though that was important. It wasn't his reputation that he had just sullied to everybody that knew, though that was important. It was the relationship. Run. And you servants of mine, put on the biggest party possible, because my son is back. He's home. Let's celebrate. I don't know if you know, I didn't, the significance of the gifts that he had his servants get. I take this time to tell you these things because it just further tells me the mind and the heart of this Father in Jesus' story. Robe. Go get the finest robe. What did the robe represent? In that day and age, when you had a guest, and hospitality was huge, when you had a guest come over, you put a robe on them. It was to demonstrate honor. You are an honored guest in my house. He didn't just ask for any robe that would have been an honor. He asked for his own robe to be put on his son. The highest honor. To this son. And the ring in that day and age represented authority. If you had your father's ring on, you could make decisions on behalf of the family. You could, in fact, sign away. You had that kind of authority. Would you give that to somebody who had just squandered a third of all that you owned? Moves beyond a story here for me. Maybe it does for you. Think about it in practical terms. A third of everything you own, gone. You've not even heard a full confession. And you're willing to put in his hands, the authority for everything else you own. Finally, he asked for them to put sandals on. You know about the dirty roads, I'm sure. Maybe you know, but maybe you don't know that there was a distinction behind having sandals. I mentioned the servants, not the hired ones, the regular servants. Those servants had children that would not have had shoes on. They would have been barefoot. That's how you knew they weren't part of the family. Because the sons and daughters had shoes. Something so simple that had sandals. But it was a way of understanding the difference. Yet again, it's not even for the regular servants. He's making a point to say, give them the very best. Do we do this today? Maybe you do. But what a standard. What a standard set for the best of the best. What a standard set for those of us who love and try to follow Jesus. Those of us who take our responsibility seriously to care for those under us. Those of us who have spent our lifetimes trying to increase our ability to handle responsibility. This is still a significant standard. Somebody that's wronged you like this so publicly, and you're going to embrace them without even a full-fledged apology? And you're not just going to embrace them, you're going to lavishly pour out blessing upon them? But remember, Jesus wasn't talking to the best of the best. Well, he was. They were listening, so to speak. But he was talking to the tax collectors and the sinners. And those religious leaders, those on the inside, those who had the law and were so proud that they followed it, those of us who were on the inside, looked on and listened as he told this story. And I'm challenged today. I'm challenged today to ask myself, do I do this? Am I this kind of a person? I don't have to even get to the details. Am I this kind of a man? I don't have children of my own, but I've got plenty of opportunities to serve in that role to others. Besides the fact that I'm a pastor, the leader or father of a flock, if you will. And I'm challenged. Do I love you this way? Do I love you this way when you're being good to me? Would I love you this way if you had wronged me so substantially? And all these problems that we're having and all the uproar in our culture right now, all the people who feel slighted. Oh, I could get into all the debate. Maybe you could too. Maybe we have. But I find myself asking a question this morning. If I could know like God knows, if I could know like Jesus knows, what led people to feel so slighted? What led people down the road that they've traveled that's gotten them into all sorts of places that they don't want to be? I suspect that among other things, I'd find one common denominator: a lack of love. A lack of feeling genuinely loved, deeply loved, approved, accepted, and loved like this kind of love. And so I wonder, as a Jesus follower, as one of God's own, I wonder what our responsibility is. I wonder if we hear in this story a God we recognize. I wonder if we call him Father. I wonder if we know him intimately. I wonder if our conversations with him regularly involve this kind of love. Not just from him to us, although maybe we need that, and there's nothing wrong with needing that and asking for it. But maybe it involves what we're to do with that love. Maybe it involves how we might extend his love to others. Maybe it involves how we might represent him to others by the way in which we love them. What would it look like, church, if we were known as a group of people to those around us as a church that loves like this, that loves sinners like this? What would it be for, excuse me ladies for a minute, for those of us men to be known this way? I don't mean any offense to you guys at all, seriously, you men right now. I'll just tell you in my own life that most of the families I've known, the moms were the ones taking care of the kids. The moms were the ones that were often involved in outreach. And I'm not saying there aren't guys that I've known that do that. I'm just telling you that I'm convicted once again that we need men to step up and do this. We need men to step up right alongside the women and serve in this way. We need men to step up and make a statement to our community and to those who don't have fathers. We're willing to stand in that place and care for you as well. Not because it's a good idea, not because it would just bless our community, but because the one we follow, the one we call Lord, tells us this is his way. Pretty significant marching orders. But it's also a great opportunity. Because I know that you know, surely you know what it's like to love somebody that is surprised by your love. Right? They're not expecting it. And they're so taken aback. What an opportunity in today's country, today's culture, today's Rock Hill, today's York County, for us to be this kind of lovers, this kind of caretakers, this kind of reach out and bless other people. As we celebrate Father's Day today, maybe we men can use this story as a goal. Maybe we can use this as a challenge to us, not just for our own kids, but maybe if we'll look around and ask the Lord to open our eyes to some other kid near us or some other person near us that needs this kind of love. Maybe we'll have the opportunity to demonstrate our teaching. And for those who aren't fathers, and for those who are, in particular, ladies, we can pray. We can pray for these guys, right? We can pray for their strength and their protection. We can pray for their courage and their determination. We can pray for a determination to be this kind of father to our own children and to those in the community. Don't miss the profound opportunity we have